All right, so this is going to be a review that I'm making for y'all for Content Area 10. And just as a reminder, we are going to want to spend, you're going to want to spend most of your time thinking about Content Area 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then 10. That's how they are going to be broken up in terms of importance on the test. And so I just want you guys to kind of utilize these review videos as a way for you to just kind of remind yourself of the things we've talked about, remind yourself of the pieces that you're supposed to do on your own that hopefully you did, and then just kind of remember some of our big ideas from these content areas. So, sorry, I want to make sure it's recording. This is fine. Oh, yes. Okay, it is. Sorry, guys. I just don't want to do all this. I'll record. All right. So, we had those two main ideas that we talked about with Content Area 10 that we were going to see. And so, number one, this idea that contemporary art, global contemporary art is going to transcend that which is traditional, right? It's going to be pushing past that. We're going to see a change in how images are accessed. We're going to see changes in what is considered fine art. We're going to see changes in not only a wider variety of artists, but also a wider variety of audiences, depending on how the work is displayed. And then the other thing we talked about was how important it is to experience this as a global context. And so when we think about these works and we look at these works, you have to remember that we're seeing stuff that may not necessarily be in a museum, or it may be, or even our concept of what a museum is has changed. We're no longer as Eurocentric focused as a culture. And so that's going to affect how we see work differently. So we talked about temporary art. We looked at the work of Yayoi Kusama before, and we talked about installations and how there can be benefits of installations. So in this, our first piece for this content area was The Gates by Christo and Jean-Claude. Remember that this was an idea, a plan that took like 26 years in the making. Only to be up for 2 weeks in February in 2005. So that idea of a work that is on display for a moment and then being gone, there's something powerful to that, right? There's something powerful about the aesthetic as being temporary, as being fragile, right? Not meant to last, as being an immersive experience. Another thing that they were dealing with here with this work was ideas about path, right? And finding a path. That idea can tie into Buddhism. Ideas related to India, also through the use of this color saffron that they utilized. Remember that the width of the gates depended on the width of the already existing path. And so, another thing we're thinking about here is that contrast between the man-made environment versus the natural world, and how those things are interacting, how those things are coming together at this site, at this moment. It was expensive. Remember that the Christo and Jean-Claude pay for their work with by selling their drawings and independent financials. They're not. It's free for people to visit. So just again, this idea that the temporary quality is an aesthetic decision. This is intentional. This is something that they were really trying to highlight as memorable because it is limited, right? Because it is just there for a period of time, like childhood or high school or a bouquet of fresh flowers, right? Things that are temporary that take on that sweetness because they are limited. If you see fabric out in nature like this, got to be Christo and Jean Claude. And then we looked at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and we talked about how important it was with Maya Lin in this work, how she cut into the ground. Sorry, I'm trying to answer an art history question here. All right, so Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So this is Maya Lin, and we talked about the fact that she got this commission as a blind entry with 1,400 different submissions to build this commemorative monument for the U.S. As requested by the government. And so this is a piece of public art, a piece of art that belongs to us as a nation, right? And when we're thinking about this type of space and we're thinking about this environment, it was so different. This is change, right? For the most part, this is change. This is the idea of taking something that is funerary, is related to war, is a memorial, and doing it in such a way that it encompasses large groups of people, right? 58,000 names or something, as opposed to something like this, which would be a more traditional, typical monument, which is going to highlight just some specific groups or specific types of people. So the importance of the name and how that ties in here with Maya Lin's work. This, neither the Gates nor Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial have been on the AP exam as FRQs, so those are good pieces to know. All right, Horn Players by Basquiat. This work, well, not this work, but another Basquiat was on the AP exam as an FRQ. It was an attribution question. So it showed a different work by Basquiat and asked the artist to justify. So remember that Basquiat is working in this neo-expressionism. It's about telling of ideas, telling of these famous and important Black musicians that have often been neglected or not emphasized in history. Okay. Typical Basquiat, he includes text, he includes bright color, repetition, these kind of patches of color. He is really trying to get us to question how people of color, specifically men of color, are depicted in fine art, both as content and as artists. Lots of wordplay in his work. He's challenging the status quo. Looks back to other artists and styles. So Da Vinci, Manet, Picasso, and influenced by jazz. All right, so Summer Trees by Song Sunam. This is tradition and change. This is a ink painting, which we know is typical for East Asia, but for it to be done in such an abstracted way is a big change. So again, man in the natural world is going to be another theme, right? This is tradition. This is change because the content is so much more abstracted, but it's still that same media hanging on, right? So ink on paper. When we're thinking about the overall shape, it's emphasis on the vertical, emphasis on a value changes. So we have light, we have grays, we have black. It feels flat, right? That's what meant by shallow space, as opposed to a piece that feels like it has depth. These pieces are not big, about 2 feet tall. part of a series. When you think about ink painting, typically you think about it as a more minimalist approach to painting. And definitely that's true of Sang Sunam as well. It has this, limited or restraint to it. We talked about the fact that, or you guys were supposed to do this on your own, but that idea that these pine trees can represent men of good character. And so to have these pine trees together as a group, this could be referencing, a group of upstanding men, a group of men with not only good character, but also education, right? All right. Then we looked at Aberconowitz's Androgyne 3. This piece nor Summertree have been on the AP exam as FRQs. So they might have been on the AP exam as multiple choice questions, but they don't release those. So I would not be able to tell you that. Right. So remember, Magdalena Aberconowitz is really dealing with this idea of the figure, the human body, and how it is impacted by the contextual events that surround it. She's dealing with the horrors of war and violence. She's dealing with this time of change and transition as you go from, as she went from this, upper class, part of the aristocracy, sorry, that she is this protected young girl, right, who spends her days in leisure. And then all of a sudden, when the wars start, she has such change in her life, such dramatic change. And it's this point of having to grow up quickly, right? And she begins working in these acute care facilities for injured soldiers, and she has to hide her legacy of who she is, and so all of that is affecting her her mentality and her way that she views the world. So if you'll remember, she had a friend who she would but he like loaned her his back for her to be able to make the cast form of this. And then she was able to cast the burlap over that form over and over and over again. The reason she got into fibers and sculpture was to avoid being a painter. She did not want to be forced to work in that style of social realism, similar to what Chairman Mao had been doing in China, right? Forcing artists to work in a certain way to build propaganda. So we talked about her process. She dips the burlap in resin, lays it on the body. This idea of dehumanization in the 20th century, especially when you're talking about mass casualty events like war, like COVID numbers, right? The amount of numbers, the amount of people that those represent can be overwhelming. Each one has a little bit different surface, right? Because she's using her hands as the media to apply. All right, Book from the Sky by Zhu Bing. This is one of the installations we looked at. Remember that for this piece, he developed 1,000 characters that are not real letters, but instead appear similar to a Chinese character. And then he prints them using a typesetting process, prints them on paper, on those banners that go across the sky, and on the panels that go on the wall. So he's creating something that is enveloping a space, right? And then if you walk through this, you would be immersed in this space. We talked about how the books, as they're open up, become this undulation of waves. And so all of this text actually means nothing, right? It's nonsense. It's not real words. And so he talks about it representing these two different parts of his upbringing. living under the Mao regime and the propaganda and the information that was spread, and then what it looked like after Mao's death, when you had this influx of Western literature and ideas and a philosophy coming into China, and how that changed so much of the available information and so much of the conversations and ideas that were shared. And so he's kind of reflecting on this idea of information, right? And how information can be used for good and how information can be used as a propaganda tool, the different forms. Being an installation, it can be, packed up and shipped and displayed different places. Oh, then we talked about banality, this idea of common, trite, uninspired, something lacking originality, right? Unoriginal. And these are not things you typically want to have used to describe your art or your ideas or your style or whatever. But that's what is happening here with Pink Panther. This also has not been on the AP exam before. Pink Panther by Jeff Koons. Little postmodern kitsch here. So remember that Jeff Koons tells us he's not concerned about his own sexuality, his own spirituality. He's thinking about societal views of these topics. He's thinking about how society views relationships and entertainment and economic ideas and government, and then he's trying to respond that back in his work. Usually sexuality is a pretty big part of his focus, as are kind of pop icon figures. So this was made in a series of 4. Remember that it was shown 3 different places all at one time. To get that idea of this is an object that can be reproduced. This is an object that has been, it's a step further than Duchamp and saying, well, he chose it, because in reality, there is some conceptual idea here that he's putting forth. But Jay Mansfield's a real person, and the Pink Panther was somebody else's, cartoon character idea they came up with. And so bringing them together like this is a new thought. However, remember, somebody else is actually going through the production of casting it and having it made. And so there's sometimes some questions about, I guess his process would be the nice way of saying it, right? So he's taking something that would typically be cheap, right? This shiny, glossy, ceramic, mass-produced object, but he's giving it to us large scale. He's giving it to us as this important object. So much of what we see in postmodernism, if you'll remember all the way back to the House at Newcastle, right? Postmodern is a critique of society, current society, mass culture, what is expected or appreciated or used in mass culture. And so this is going to be very typical, and something, if you were going to write about postmodern, that you could go back to, is that idea of how is it critiquing this contemporary culture. And remember that most postmodernists, or in fact, just most global contemporary artists, are thinking about art history. They're thinking about, okay, where do I fall? Am I more like the Baroque? Am I more like the Rococo? Am I more like the Renaissance? And so they're looking back to the past as influence on their work. And so specifically, Koons says that he is influenced by Rococo and he's influenced by Baroque. Kitsch. All right. This is a photograph. Remember that our artist, Cindy Sherman, is the photographer as well as the model. It's part of a series called History Portraits, where she is, or she actually went right to Rome, and she bought different costumes there, cheap, maybe even tacky costumes. And then she ends up going to the public library, looking at reproduced images of these famous paintings and then recreating them on her own. So it's that idea of she's deconstructing the idea of what is a portrait. She's deconstructing what is a painting, right? What is a historical painting? She's deconstructing our idea of what is truth, right? Because by giving us, and I tell you guys this, modern art is truth, right? But she's reminding you that paintings even and photography can be manipulated, right? And so there's this question of how authentic is what she's doing. And so she's highlighting the artificial, she's highlighting the absurd, she's allowing it to be garish and kitschy and tacky and ridiculous in a lot of ways. In this piece, she is reenacting a heroine from the Old Testament who has just slayed the head of an Assyrian general. And so it's this feminist role that she's taking on here. Identity, she talks about how she's influenced by that change, those changing cultures of the 60s and 70s when she was coming of age. She's dealing with gender stereotypes. She prints them large, 7x4. Okay, Dancing from the Louvre. This is by Faith Ringgold. This was a piece you guys were supposed to do on your own. Again, I don't think this will be on the AP exam because it's already been an FRQ, but we're going to cover it real quick anyway. So Dancing at the Louvre is a quilt, a story quilt from a series called The French Collection. And what she does here is she paints on canvas that she then pieces as a quilt. And so she's working on a loose fabric, loose canvas fabric, as opposed to stretched canvas. And then as she quilts it together, it becomes this this object of tradition change, right? Because when we think about quilting groups, when we think about usually older ladies coming together, usually ladies, usually older, usually in the deep South, coming together as a collective art form and creating something that is the result of multiple people's work and ideas. And so she's giving us that kind of idea, but it's meant to hang on the wall. It's meant to be of fine art. And then notice in the back, we have 3 pieces of Da Vinci's work, right? Where we have a male artist depicting women. And then in the front, you have her, protagonist in her story, a woman of color. And she's a woman of color that she's creating this. And so she's dealing with racial identity. She's dealing with women's roles. She's dealing with this idea of collaborative art versus an individual art, tradition and change. She's critiquing art history and how art history depicts different people and including genders and races. Willem Marie Simone is the girl. And it's a made up story, but this protagonist is going through, this character is going through, but she's using it to reimagine what if art history included women of color, right? What would that look like? How would it be different? It's a narrative, right? It's told as a story. She's appropriating. We talked about appropriation when you use an image that is not yours. I love this. She offers an alternative to the European and masculine perspective so prevalent in art history. All right. We talked about Trade, Gifts for Trading Land with White People by Jan Kwik Smith. Remember that she made this on the 500th anniversary of Columbus arriving at what we now call the United States. So this is a counter argument to works like The Oxbow by Thomas Cole, right? This idea of manifest destiny. She tells us with this work and in her title, Gifts for Trading Land with White People. So what do you get if you give up your land to white people? Well, you get to be made into a mascot, a advertisement, a character to sell products or to represent a football team. And so she talks about how this is not an adequate or appropriate representation. So the objects hanging in the canvas, again, are part of the same presentation, the same piece. So just in the same way that Faith Ringgold was asking us to consider and think about how art is made, or art history often focuses on masculine, Eurocentric ideas. She's saying kind of the same thing here, right? She's asking us to consider the point of view of the indigenous Native Americans and how they would have responded to manifest destiny. So she layers up with collage and then paints on top. And the clothesline across the top, is actual objects, tchotchkes, kitsch stuff she purchased. All right, Earth's Creation by Emily Ngwore. I shared a lecture with you on this one. Again, it has not been on the AP exam. This is a good one to know. So please watch that. I shared it with you, but again, remember the main idea of what she's doing here is she's taking her traditional Aboriginal, indigenous, tribal painting, which would be typically done on rocks or cave walls or bodies or wooden drums or masks. And she's doing it on canvas. And she's doing it in a way where she's allowing those colors to overlap and mix and blend, as opposed to the highly regulated dot of the ritual painting. So she didn't start painting as really an art form until she was 79. And so she is what we call a primitive artist, right? An untrained in the traditional art sense. So if y'all remember, she takes the brush, she holds it very vertical, she dips it in the different pots of paint, and then she oftentimes double dips. And so you get these kind of rings of circles of color that have a ring of another color around them. She's allowing blending. This piece is the first piece by an Aboriginal Australian woman to sell for over $1 million. And so this would be the type of painting that she was taught. And then this is kind of her approach, how she moves into this more as an art form. And it's supposed to represent earth creation, the lush season, spring, right? After the rains. Large. All right, Rebellious Silence by Shirin Neshat. Remember that Shirin is the person, the artist who came up with the idea, and she is the woman in the image. The text is written on top of the printed photograph. It's not actually on her skin. The Women of Allah series always contain 4 different elements: veil, gun, Shirin, and text. Right, veil, gun, Shirin Neshat, and text. And so with her work, she's using poetry that others have written, right, in this text, and she's asking us to consider a lot of contradictions: East versus West, how maybe Christianity is viewed versus Islam, what is viewed maybe as oppressive versus what is freedom, right? So asking us these questions. So this has also never been on the exam. She talks about returning the gaze. And probably the biggest event to tie in with her life is the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, and how that changed so much her cultural context, so that when she came home after going to Iran, after going to college and working in the US, the world had changed. Women's roles had changed. Her home had changed. And so she's dealing with that. She's processing that through these images. And again, another good tradition there, that the importance of text and calligraphy. All right, so I will do the rest in part 2.